Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to the summer of 1914. The fading smile of peace. The summer of 1914 was exceptionally bright. Europe's fields shimmered with golden wheat, and people planned long vacations in a peace they believed would last forever. Yet behind this serene facade, unseen gears began to slowly interlock. A single gunshot in a quiet Sarajevo alley. It was like a stone thrown into a still lake, its ripples quickly spreading, threatening to shake the very foundations of centuries-old empires. The village bells no longer chimed for peace. Instead, mobilization orders appeared on town squares, and young men, clutching bouquets, boarded trains. Promising to return before the leaves fell, they surrendered to the rhythmic pulse of the steam engines, carried towards an unknown front. Only the steady clatter of the train wheels against the tracks pierced the night air, a sound like the heavy breath of history itself, the advance of the great tide. Pouring across the Belgian border into France, the German army moved like an endless gray ocean. The rhythmic thud of millions of leather boots on dry earth became a colossal drumbeat, sending shivers across Europe. The sun beat down relentlessly, dusting the soldiers' shoulders with white powder. Under the grand gamble of the Schlieffen Plan, this mechanically precise force pressed relentlessly towards Paris. But on the banks of the Marne River, that great tide finally halted, as Parisian taxicabs, their headlights flickering, ferried reinforcements under the cover of night. A peculiar tension hung over the front. The river flowed silently, but its surface hinted at the storm that was about to break. In what became known as the miracle of the Marne, the era of mobile warfare began to fade. The young men who had envisioned a swift victory now realized they would have to dig into the cold earth, not sweep across open fields. The earth claims its soldiers. The age of glorious cavalry charges and fluttering banners vanished like smoke. Soldiers now looked not to the sky, but to the ground beneath their feet. The mournful scraping sound of shovels biting into the earth echoed across the front lines. What began as shallow pits soon became a vast interconnected labyrinth. A deep scar stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea began to tear across the heart of Europe. As the cold winter mist seeped into the trenches, the soldiers realized the war had just begun, and this dark underground world they had carved out would be their home for the foreseeable future. Rifle barrels grew cold, and the distant rumble of artillery settled into a low, heavy lullaby. The earth, holding the fate of millions of young lives, descended into a long, silent winter. The architecture of the underworld. By the dawn of 1915, the landscape of Europe had transformed into a subterranean world. Imagine a civilization carved into the very skin of the earth, stretching for hundreds of miles. This was the labyrinth of the trenches, a world 3 feet wide and 7 feet deep, where the sky was merely a thin ribbon of gray seen from the bottom of a muddy trench. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp clay and wood smoke. In the quiet hours of the night, you could hear the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water echoing through the dugouts, a slow percussion measuring the passing of time. The horizon was replaced by the texture of sandbags and timber. Home was a small niche carved into the dirt, lit by the flickering amber glow of a single candle. In this narrow world, life settled into a strange, somnolent rhythm. A long wait punctuated by the distant, muffled thrum of the guns. The drum fire of Verdun. As 1916 arrived, the silence of the trenches was shattered by a new and terrifying rhythm. At the historic city of Verdun, the German command unleashed a storm of steel unlike anything ever seen. They called it Trommelfeuer, drum fire. It was a continuous rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the very marrow of a man's bones. Thousands of heavy guns fired in unison, creating a low-frequency hum of destruction that lasted for months. In this chaos, a grim order emerged. Along the Sacred Way, the single road into the city, thousands of trucks moved in a never-ending hypnotic loop, shuttling reinforcements into the heart of the fire. The battle became a living machine, a relentless cycle of endurance where the only constant was the steady heartbeat of the artillery. The soil was churned until it became a fine, suffocating powder, and the landscape was transformed into a lunar wasteland, stripped of all color and life. The tragic dawn of the Somme. While the earth trembled at Verdun, the British and French prepared their own grand symphony along the Somme River. July 1st, 1916, began as a breathtakingly beautiful morning. For a few moments after the week-long bombardment stopped, the air was eerily, profoundly silent. Thousands of young men climbed out of their trenches, moving forward in neat, rhythmic lines as if on a Sunday stroll. But the silence was a trap. From the broken earth, the rhythmic rat-tat-tat of machine guns began to stitch across the golden wheat fields. It was a mechanical, cold sound, the sound of the industrial age meeting flesh and blood. By sunset, 60,000 had fallen. The Somme became a graveyard of dreams, where the courage of a generation was measured against the cold precision of iron. As the rain began to fall, a steady rhythmic drizzle, the battlefields turned into a sea of sludge, and the world settled into a heavy winter of the soul, waiting for a dawn that felt a lifetime away. The rhythms of the Atlantic. As the war on land remained locked in a frozen embrace, a different battle unfolded across the vast, lonely stretches of the Atlantic. Imagine the hypnotic swaying of deep blue waves, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Beneath this restless surface, a new hunter moved through the dark, the U-boat. These iron shadows cruised through the cold depths with a slow, mechanical pulse, their presence marked only by a silver trail of a periscope cutting through the foam. On the decks of merchant ships, sailors kept an anxious vigil. The sound of the ocean was their constant companion, the rhythmic creaking of timber, the steady thrum of steam engines, and the splashing of salt spray. It was a war of nerves and silence, a journey through the mist where the world felt infinite and the danger remained hidden in the deep, muffled quiet of the sea. The stirring of a giant. In the spring of 1917, the rhythm of history began to shift. Across the ocean, the giant of the West, the United States, began to stir. What started as a whisper in the dark, a secret telegram tapped out in code, soon became a roar of production. Peacetime factories transformed into a steady, powerful engine of war. In town squares under the soft glow of twilight, people gathered to hear news of a world on fire, feeling a new sense of purpose in the air. The arrival of the doughboys on the French coast brought a new energy to the exhausted continent. As they marched through ancient cobblestone streets, the sound of their brass bands echoed against stone walls, playing upbeat rhythmic marches. They moved with a steady, confident pace, their voices humming songs of home. For the weary allies, this fresh influx of life was like a deep, revitalizing breath, a flicker of light in the dim, gray world of the front. The Eastern Silence. While the West found new strength, the vast, icy plains of the East witnessed a different kind of ending. In Russia, the weight of the war had become too heavy. Imagine a winter so deep that the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of snow under the boots of hungry, tired soldiers. In the flickering candlelight of palaces, the scratching of pens marked the end of an empire. With the signing of a peace treaty, the Eastern Front fell into a profound, chilling silence. For Germany, this was a moment of desperate hope. Hundreds of trains began a long, rhythmic journey across the continent, their wheels clattering endlessly over iron rails as they carried 500,000 battle-hardened soldiers to the west for one final titanic gamble. The stage was set for the greatest storm of all, a race against time before the sun set on the old world forever. The gathering hurricane. By the spring of 1918, a heavy, unnatural silence settled over the Western Front. It was the storm before the dawn. Germany, now reinforced by troops from the East, prepared for the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle. In the pre-dawn gloom, elite stormtroopers waited in the trenches, their rhythmic breathing the only sound in the mist. They knew time was their enemy. The American giant was arriving in greater numbers every day. On March 21st, the world trembled. 6,000 guns fired in unison, creating a roar so immense it was felt across the ocean. A thick yellow fog of gas rolled across no man's land, swallowing the earth in a ghostly shroud. Out of this mist, the stormtroopers surged forward with a desperate, feverish energy. The static world of the trenches was suddenly replaced by a frantic, rhythmic retreat. For a brief moment, it seemed the German gamble might succeed as they reached toward the Marne once more. But the exhaustion of 4 long years was beginning to claim the heart of the empire. The Black Day of the German Army. As the German momentum waned in the summer heat, the Allies prepared their final synchronized counterstroke. August 8th began with a milky fog near Amiens. In the muffled silence, a new sound emerged. A low, mechanical growl that vibrated through the damp soil. Hundreds of tanks, the Iron Cavalry, crawled forward in a slow, rhythmic march. When the sun finally burned through the mist, the German lines faced an unstoppable sea of steel and khaki. This was the Black Day of the German Army. The rhythm of the German defense, which had held for years, finally snapped. Thousands of soldiers, realizing the end was near, began to lay down their arms. The sound of battle was no longer just the crash of shells, but the rhythmic, heavy crunch of thousands of boots marching eastward, back toward a home they had almost forgotten. The falling crowns. As the leaves turned gold and red, falling softly into the muddy craters, the ancient empires of the Old World began to crumble. Bulgaria fell, then the Ottomans, and finally, the Austro-Hungarian mosaic disintegrated. In the north of Germany, the rhythmic clanging of hammers shifted from building warships to dismantling the old order. Sailors refused to sail, and workers marched through the streets of Berlin in a steady, unstoppable rhythm of revolution. On a cold November morning, a train sat idling on a quiet siding near the Belgian border, its engine exhaling a slow pulse of steam. Inside sat the Kaiser, watching his dream of glory vanish into the mist. With a final somber whistle, the train moved toward exile, its wheels clicking rhythmically against the iron rails. The old world of emperors was gone. The guns were still firing at the front, but the heart of the empire had stopped beating. The world was now holding its breath for the final, most famous silence of all. The silence in the forest. Imagine a secluded clearing in the forest of Compiègne. The morning of November 11th, 1918, was draped in a thick silver mist that clung to the damp bark of ancient oak trees. In this stillness sat a wooden railway carriage, lit by the flickering amber glow of oil lamps. Inside, there was no grand ceremony, only the soft rhythmic scratching of pens on parchment. The representatives of exhausted nations moved with a slow, weary dignity. Outside, the only sound was the gentle patter of water droplets falling from wet leaves onto the roof of the train. At 5:12 a.m., the final signatures were placed. A message was tapped out in a rhythmic series of dots and dashes, traveling through telegraph wires to every muddy trench. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the world would finally stop. The great stillness. As the clock ticked toward 11, a haunting atmosphere settled over the battlefields. Soldiers in the trenches stood frozen, their pocket watches held in trembling hands, listening to the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the passing seconds. Then, as the minute hand reached the top of the hour, the world did something it had forgotten how to do for 4 long years. It became silent. This silence was not the quiet of a peaceful night. It was a heavy, deafening roar of stillness. For the first time in 1,566 days, the thundering of the guns ceased. In the trenches, men didn't cheer. They simply sat down in the mud, listening to the incredible sound of nothing. Slowly, soldiers from both sides climbed out of their holes, standing atop the parapets like ghosts emerging from the earth. There was no hatred left, only a profound rhythmic sense of relief that the nightmare had ended. The Garden of Remembrance. The war left behind a long shadow, a quiet, internal rhythm of memories. The fields of France and Belgium, once scarred by fire, were eventually covered in a thin, rhythmic dusting of winter snow, and later, by the soft blooming of red poppies. These flowers, which once thrived in the disturbed soil of the trenches, became a symbol of life persisting in the face of destruction. Today, the former battlefields are gardens of quiet reflection. Imagine the rhythmic rows of white stones standing under the shade of ancient trees. Every year, during the 2 minutes of silence, the world stops once more, breathing in a slow, synchronized rhythm to remember the lost. The rhythm of war has been replaced by the peaceful pulse of the modern age. As our journey ends, let the weight of the story settle softly into your mind. The empires have fallen. The trenches are filled, and the soldiers are finally at rest. The night is vast and calm, lit by the same stars that once watched over the weary watchers in no man's land. Let your breath find a slow, rhythmic pace, drifting into a deep, dreamless, and well-earned sleep.